Hey, it's Justin from Transistor, and today I'm going to explain how private podcast feeds work. They're also called private RSS feeds. Now, normally with a public podcast, you publish episodes using a podcast hosting provider, and once you have a few episodes in your feed, you generally submit it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, etc. And when you submit it to those platforms, you're really submitting it to their online directory so that people browsing, in this case Spotify, can find episodes that interest them and click through and actually follow the show and listen to episodes. Now, these public podcasts still use an RSS feed. All of the platforms are still checking the RSS feed for that public show and updating their directory based on the RSS feed. Private podcasts is different. Instead of just generating one public RSS feed that you then submit to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Google Podcasts, most private podcast providers generate multiple feeds for each subscriber. Each subscriber can then in turn add that podcast feed directly to their listening app, which bypasses the online directory entirely. You've probably seen private podcast feeds on Patreon. If you support a creator on Patreon, they'll often give you a private podcast link, which you can then manually add to your podcast player. Let me show you how this works on Transistor from a publisher's standpoint and a subscriber standpoint. So I've created a private podcast here. It has an episode published already. And now I'm going to invite a subscriber to subscribe to the show. Now, this could be a paid subscriber, or it could be an internal podcast for employees. In this case, let's say that I've just paid to access the feed. After the checkout, I send the subscriber here so they can opt in with their email address. Now on their phone, they can open up that invite email and then add it to their private podcast player with one click. In this case, I'll choose Apple Podcasts. I click subscribe, and now I'm subscribed to this private podcast. Every time the publisher publishes a new episode, I'll receive it in Apple Podcasts. Let's see what this looks like from a technical standpoint. This subscriber has access to this private landing page. They have a unique subscriber token here in the URL, and their RSS feed has that token as well. This RSS feed and this landing page have been created just for this subscriber. Now, like many things on the web, there's a tension here between making things easy for subscribers, so it's easy for them to add their private podcast to Apple Podcasts, and trying to reduce piracy, making sure that people who shouldn't receive the private RSS feed don't get access. This tension is as old as the web. There's an old article on Daring Fireball where he talks about Google Reader accidentally indexing one of his private RSS feeds for his blog post readers. And based on what we learned from this history, there are things that have been added to discourage them from being copied and submitted to public directories. The one thing you should check for is make sure that your private podcast feed has Google Play block enabled and iTunes block enabled. When these tags are present, public directories like Google Podcasts and Apple won't allow you to submit private RSS feeds to their directories. In Google's case, they also won't index your podcast on the Google search engine. But what happens if a private subscriber shares their RSS feed with other people or posts it on a public forum? Well, again, there's this tension between giving people access easily and piracy or it getting into the wrong hands. And in Transistor's case, we've chosen to make it more easy for people. Even if you encrypt audio end to end and you put as much security as you can on it, once the audio arrives on somebody's device, their computer or the phone, it can still be screen captured, scraped, ripped, and it's not that difficult to do. So if you're really concerned about privacy or security for the content you're publishing, you probably shouldn't be publishing it on the internet at all, whether it's text, video, or audio. However, there are some measures in place to allow you to monitor your feed and make sure that nobody is sharing it with other folks. You can see this in analytics. If I go into this episode here, I can see this subscriber has downloaded the episode 2 times. And that's pretty reasonable. But if I logged in here and I saw a subscriber who had downloaded an episode 521 times, I know there's probably a problem, that their invite URL has been shared or the RSS feed has been shared, and we need to remove access to this person. And in Transistor, this is pretty easy. I just find that subscriber, I click the remove link, and now nobody will have access to that RSS feed or the landing page, anything to do with that podcast. And if it was anywhere online, nobody would be able to access it or download MP3s from it. Now, you can use a private podcast as an internal staff podcast, similar to an audio newsletter. And we have a lot of CEOs that are doing this. They record a weekly update on a microphone, they go into Transistor, they upload that new episode, and then they share it with their team. But private podcasts also provide monetization options for podcasters, authors, and all sorts of internet creators. You can now charge for a premium version of your podcast, or if you want to record and distribute your audiobook yourself, you can do that with a private podcast. It's also great for membership sites and gives members an additional perk for their paid membership. Hopefully, I've answered a lot of your questions about private podcasts, private RSS feeds, and paid private podcasts. If you have any more questions, you can put those in the comments below, or you can go to transistor.fm, open up that live chat widget, and we'd be happy to answer your questions.
Transistor is modern podcast hosting. It's the easy way to upload your audio, submit your show to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and get listener analytics. If you're looking to start a podcast in 2021, or you have existing podcasts that you want to migrate, get a 14-day free trial by going to transistor.fm.